good evening to everyone, and thank you all for coming. This evening we're very privileged to have with us Dr. Mohammed Waheed Hassan. He is Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the school, and he's also, of course, the immediate past President of the Maldives. Dr. Waheed was elected a Member of Parliament in 1989. He was elected Vice President of Maldives in 2008 and became President in 2012 until November 2013. He's worked for a number of UN agencies, as you know, UNESCO, UNICEF, and UNDP over the past 15 years or so. He was Special Representative of UNICEF in the very troubled country of Afghanistan at a very difficult time, and also UNICEF representative in a number of countries, other countries, including Yemen, Turkmenistan, and Macedonia. Also fairly turbulent spaces at various points. He has served as Acting Regional Director of UNICEF for South Asia and as Associate Director of the UN Development Group in New York. He's had a teaching career. He is, after all, Dr. Mohammed Waheed Hassan, and has taught at Michigan State University in East Lansing. Dr. Waheed graduated from the American University of Beirut and received his PhD from Stanford University in Educational Policy Studies, right? He holds a master's degree in political science and education as well. His current research interest is in political transitions in newly democratic countries. He's had first-hand experience, of course, on the issue of democratic transitions, having been part of the democratic movement in Maldives. Another area of policy interest, clearly, coming from the Maldives, is the issue of climate change and the problems that face small island nations in particular, some relevance, I think, to Singapore as well. Maldives, as you know, has been one of the leaders in thinking about small state security under global warming. During his stay with us, he's been engaged primarily in giving a series of talks, being available to faculty. He's teaching classes as invited by colleagues. But in terms of his larger research agenda, he's been reflecting on his past experiences and engagements. Today's talk, he advises me, is a work in progress, and of course he's hoping to get ideas and inputs from all of you as he takes this work forward. The other issues that, of course, very close to his policy thinking and research are disasters. Not a very pretty subject, but increasingly a subject in Asia that is consuming policy interest and is, of course, a human security problem going forward that's going to be of enormous significance. This is related clearly also to climate change. And a third area, as I noted, is education policy, which is his first academic interest. And I know with Professor Gopinath, he's giving lectures on education, and I might involve you in my class as well on globalization and education. So very gracious of you to agree to that. Today's topic is a broad-ranging one, but of course, in the sense that it deals with the issues of democratic transition. And it's titled Issues in Democratic Transition, Recent Experiences from the Maldives and Some Arab States. I think the focus is going to be the Maldives, but he's going to draw attention also to the recent ferment in the Arab states. With that, please join me in welcoming our guest this evening.
Thank you, Professor Kanti, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank you all for being here this evening to share some thoughts on issues related to democratic transition. My presentation today is going to be in two parts. In the first part, I will be reviewing some of the global observations on the issue of transition. I'll give you a brief introduction to Maldives, since some of you may not know much about it. Then I will also describe the process, the public demand that led to change in Maldives, and some of the milestones of the transition. In the second part, I will review the issues, and I'll try to go through it as fast as I can. These issues will be around constitutional and legal reform issues, the development of the political parties, electoral issues, coalition governments, militant democracy and rule of law, weak bureaucracies, inadequate preparation for local government, high cost of democratic transition, and economic challenges. I'll go through my paper, but as I go through, I will also try to change the slides. Slides don't describe all what I have to say today, but I hope it will give you a good idea and a taste for what's been like in the Maldives. A liberal democracy system is what many countries are hoping to achieve. Aspirations of the people in our countries is to live in a free society with representative governments and space for political participation. It is rooted in historical abuses of human rights and the desire to be treated with human dignity. Political scientists have listed about 123 countries that have gone through democratic transition since 1960. Some of them have remained democracies, others have backslided, and still others have reversed completely to authoritarianism. It shows that the path to democracy is not linear. According to Kapstein and Converse, most democracies fail during their first 5 years as leaders and institutions struggle to achieve credibility and legitimacy in the face of monumental challenges. Of the 123 democratizations since 1960, 67 gave rise to democratic regimes that survived through 2004, while the remaining 56 episodes had ended in a return to authoritarianism by the end of that year. Almost 68% of the unsuccessful democratic experiments ended during the first 5 years, and nearly 84% failed within the first 10 years. In places closer to home, in Thailand and Pakistan, the struggle over the state continues in countries that have been democratic for many years, but continues to face reversals because of strong military presence in politics. According to Slater, virtually everywhere, democracies exhibit the wobbly characteristics of fledglings, even after the aging of literal fledgling status is over. Countries like Thailand, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Jordan, Lebanon, and Pakistan have had a long history of democratic practice. Many countries in Asia and the Middle East are currently going through early phases of democratization. Maldives, Nepal, Bhutan, Tunisia are relatively new to democracy. Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen are going through revolutionary waves that have yet to find a democratic landing. Countries such as Tunisia, Egypt, and Maldives that had long periods of stable autocratic regimes have gone through historic revolutions and continue to experience the difficulties of early years of transition. In Egypt, 2 waves of revolutions have not found a democratic solution, while in Tunisia and Maldives, we have embarked on a difficult and steep path towards democracy. Recent events, as you can see also in more developed countries like US, we see that the problems exist there as well. With permission to the speaker now to sue the president, obstacles against the Obama healthcare bill, and also at grassroots level, from what you are now witnessing in Ferguson, Los Angeles, and New York. But today, my talk is mainly about emerging democracies, Maldives in particular. Maldives is the youngest democracy in Asia. I speak from my experience of the 5 years of democratic government in the Maldives from 2008 to 2013. The struggle for democracy has taken many years in Maldives. The first wave of democratic activism was in the 80s and early 90s. I had just returned from Stanford and was elected to the parliament. Then we fought in the parliament for direct elections of the president by the people, greater separation of powers, and for human rights. The second wave began to gather momentum in the early 2000s and continues until today. So democratic transition events began to unfold in Maldives before the Arab Spring, but have continued alongside. The events that have led to transition in Maldives and some Arab states have many similarities. However, unlike the Arab states, even during the most violent confrontations in the Maldives, there was no loss of life. The economic infrastructure remained untouched. The economy remained vibrant. Schools, hospitals, and government offices and businesses remained open. Maldives had its share of street demonstrations, confrontations between activists and the police, but we also had peaceful change of government through scheduled elections twice already, in 2008 and 2013. I will describe the transition process in Maldives and argue that the democratic transition is inherently destabilizing, and that the process is highly competitive and polarizing for any society. I will also argue that Maldives faces similar issues as some Arab countries and explain how in Maldives we have kept democracy on track and what more needs to be done to stabilize it. Maldives is a small country, even compared to Singapore. Most of you have heard about it as a luxury tourist destination. It comprises of 1,192 islands spread over an area of more than 1,000 square kilometers of the Indian Ocean. Our population is about 350,000, living on 192 islands, most of them under a square kilometer. Most visitors to Maldives get a very superficial understanding of the country because of the type of insulated tourism experience we provide. The tourism sector is highly volatile and susceptible to natural or man-made disasters, but it is tourism that contributes the single largest share of the GDP, estimated to be about 28%. The population of Maldives is a mix of people from different ethnic backgrounds, but due to relative isolation of the country and no major in-migration, population has remained somewhat homogeneous. The people are Sunni Muslims, speak the same language, Divehi, with minor dialectical differences. With greater integration into the world economy, however, and cultural, ideological, religious, and language differences are beginning to emerge. A more pluralistic society where individual freedoms are respected is what many Maldivians want today, while we retain a distinctly Maldivian identity. Meanwhile, globalization has also meant exposure to more conservative or radical ideas and beliefs. The Islamic sectarian or Mazhabi differences found in the Middle East and the subcontinent are beginning to show in Maldives. Increasingly, young Maldivians are beginning to join jihadi movements and getting killed in battle in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and now in Syria. Historically, Maldives shares many characteristics with other Muslim countries, particularly in the Middle East, especially Egypt. Most of the Maldives intellectuals prior to the 1970s attended Islamic universities in Egypt. Early scholars framed the constitution and government very much along the Egyptian model. Both our countries had a large number of politically marginalized young people who want to change. And as a Muslim country, the president also had final say on important religious matters. In addition, whether you call it a presidency or a monarchy, they all had a concentration of political power. And the head of state also was the head of the judiciary. The political systems are primarily based on patriarchy and clientelism. And finally, presidents had a tendency to remain in power for a long time, sometimes 20 or 30 years. In many ways, what has been said about Arab Spring is also true for Maldives. According to Margoto and Coleman, the original triggers were premised on some basic common denominators and conditions: autocratic regimes, lack of representative institutions, flagrant social economic inequalities, corruption, and nepotism. I will now talk about the demands for change and the transition milestones. In Maldives, the struggle for democracy gained momentum with the death of a prison inmate in 2004. Efforts to control prison riots led to the use of live ammunition that killed one inmate and injured several. It sparked a series of protests that culminated in mass gatherings at the Jumhuri Maidan, the Republican Square in Male, on August 12th and 13th of 2004. If this sounds familiar, 6 years later in Tunisia, we witnessed a similar event where a young street vendor burnt himself because of police harassment, an event which led to the downfall of Tunisian President Zainuddin Ben Ali and triggered the Arab Spring. Both in Maldives and Tunisia, it took the life of just one poor, unemployed youth, easily identifiable with the majority of young people in the country. Social and economic disparities and years of abuse of majority of the population provided fertile ground for political mobilization. According to Capstein and Converse, initial conditions do significantly affect the survival chances of democratic regimes. Low per capita income, high levels of inequality, high rates of poverty, and high ethnic fragmentation all harm the prospects that democracy will endure. In all these countries, what is also new is the information technology. It played a huge role in widening the social movements at great speed. Social media has democratized access to information. It has undermined the monopoly of the state over information, education, and communication. Social messaging services such as Twitter, WhatsApp, and Facebook are being used highly effectively to spread messages and to gather crowds. Researchers in Lebanon, Ma'mari and Al-Zain, have said that social media has basically rewritten the rules of politics. The intersection between new media and politics is not exclusive for the United States, as movements from Tunisia to Egypt prove that the significance of the new media's impact on political expression is international in scope. The actions that have been taking place in these countries, meaning Arab countries, were made possible due to the large use of social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and the pervasiveness of knowledge and information posted through this media. In many countries, the opposition presence on the internet has become much stronger than the state. Opposition-run websites have become more reliable and accessible than government information channels. The same potential is also being used, unfortunately, to create panic, fear, and hate. Traditional methods of control are also becoming less effective because of greater transparency. In Maldives, the leaders of August 2004 demonstrations were quickly arrested and imprisoned. International pressure led to the release of all of them. An unlikely event that also impacted democratic transition in Maldives is the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, which attracted unprecedented attention and scrutiny to local political problems. It was clear that the country could not recover from the devastation of the tsunami while it was immersed in an internal political conflict. Under pressure from internal and external actors, the government embarked on a democratic reform program in 2005. Under this program, a number of new commissions were set up: Maldives Human Rights Commission, Civil Service Commission, and so on. The program also involved revision of the existing constitution. Political parties were registered and political rallies and meetings became regular activities. As a result, pressure continued to build to expedite reforms. One of the key demands of the opposition was a democratic constitution and to have it passed in time for the next presidential election in 2008. Maldives Parliament passed the new constitution in September of 2008. This was a landmark event which would shape democratization process in the years to come. But within the first month of the ambiguities within the new constitution began to emerge over the eligibility of the two main presidential candidates. The sixth term of the incumbent Maumoon Abdul Qayyum was ending in November 2008. The new constitution prevents anyone to run for office for more than 2 terms, which raised questions about Qayyum's eligibility because he'd already been there for 6 terms. Similarly, the new constitution prohibits anyone with a criminal sentence to run for office for 5 years. This raised questions about the main opposition candidate, Nasheed, who had a criminal record. With the eligibility of the 2 main candidates in question, the Supreme Court was drawn into the conflict. In the interest of peaceful transition, the Supreme Court decided to allow both candidates to run. But this decision set a precedence for further involvement of the Supreme Court in presidential election issues that arise in the future. The 2008 presidential election was the first democratic election. Election rallies were well attended, and candidates and their supporters debated freely. These rallies were highly charged but mostly peaceful. When the first round of elections came in, no candidate won the required 50% of the vote. In the first round of voting, Maumoon got 40.6%, Nasheed 25%, and 3 smaller parties combined 32%. The only way Nasheed could win was to form a coalition with the smaller parties. With their support in the second round, Nasheed obtained 54.2%, while Maumoon got 45.7%. The coalition candidate, Mohammad Nasheed, won the election in October 2008. The first 5 years of democracy began. 2008 to 2013 was a highly contested and trying period. It was a period of adjustment, failed opportunities, and deep polarization. The government was faced with early cabinet resignations, disintegration of the winning coalition, public protests against unpopular policies, worsening public finances, and eventual resignation of the president halfway through the term, followed by accusations of forced resignation and attempts to regain power. The resignation of the president on February 7, 2012 was a watershed event in the history of modern Maldives. It tested the commitment of Maldivian people to democracy, their readiness to uphold the constitution and the rule of law, and their determination to maintain peace and stability in the country. The new government that followed was a national unity government comprising 8 political parties. It was a moment in our history that required greater unity among the political actors than any other time. All political parties were invited to join the new government. All joined, except for the party of the outgoing president. A roadmap for reforms leading to elections was developed with the assistance of the United Nations, and a process of all-party talks initiated. The coalition government managed the next 2 years with the primary objective of maintaining peace and stability leading to free and fair elections in 2013. National Unity Government was able to establish a situation of normalcy and create a more stable environment for development and peaceful elections. Thank you. Okay, so I will now proceed to the second part. I will examine the issues and challenges that have to be addressed and resolved for democracy to become more stable in Maldives. One of the most frequently asked questions is if country is ready for full democracy. There are objective conditions on the ground that contribute to the success or failure of democratic movements. First one is a cognitive argument. A Western liberal democracy requires a population that understands Western liberal values about human rights, individual freedoms, responsibilities, and equality. These values are summed up as modernity. Education is an essential part of modernization. In Jordan, the government is currently promoting a democracy education for young people. There are those who continue to ask if Islam is compatible with democracy. I agree with those who argue that the real question is not about compatibility. It is more a political struggle and a balance of power between those who seek a more moderate and democratic Islam and those who pursue an authoritarian version of it. The second argument is about economic readiness. Countries have to reach a certain level of economic growth for democracy to thrive. Countries with high public debt, low income, and high economic disparities are likely to be more vulnerable to corruption. And the third argument relates to the strength and the independence of state institutions such as civil service, central bank, and election commissions. The failure of modernization and economic development may be largely responsible for the rise of anti-democratic movements and fundamentalist worldviews. The movement against Western liberal education in Afghanistan and in Nigeria, and the rapid rise of Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Elements of these alternative worldviews exist in many Asian and Middle Eastern countries struggling to develop their democracies. Let me quickly go through the constitutional issues that have to be addressed. Maldives had its first constitution and cabinet government in 1932. Since then, there have been many revisions and constitutions. But until the adoption of the constitution in 2008, there was no strict separation of powers, multi-party elections, or a comprehensive Bill of Rights. The new constitution granted Maldivian fundamental freedoms of assembly, free speech, protection from arbitrary arrests, etc. But for the first time, it also stated that the official religion of Maldives is Islam, and that to become a Maldivian citizen, one had to be Muslim first. Both these articles are matters of concern for the liberal educated youth as well as human rights organizations. The constitution was based on the constitutions of more advanced countries without adequate regard for the social and cultural context of the Maldivian society. The 2008-2013 was the first 5 years of the new constitutional, and many glitches became obvious. The government has to now formulate a comprehensive legislative agenda to address the inconsistencies and shortages which then has to be steadily and systematically passed through the parliament. This must include a sincere effort to recalibrate the powers of the three branches of government. It is a complex task which requires cross-party collaboration. It must also include the revision of existing laws to make them fully compatible with the new constitution. And more importantly, we must identify modification changes to the constitution that are needed to make democracy function smoothly in our country. About political parties. There had not been any legal framework for political parties when they were established. First time political parties were established in 1952. Then after 1953, restoration of the monarchy, and until 2005, there were no political parties in Maldives. Problems with the political parties, first of all, there is no clear philosophy or ideology. Parties come out with election manifestos. There is no fundamental difference between party programs, but I can't complain about it because in many countries it's the same way now. So as a result, the difference is more about personalities. And all parties revolve around leading political figures. MDP revolves around former President Nasheed, while the ruling PPM revolves around former President Gayoom. Each of these parties will have to figure out how to go beyond personalities and institute internal systems that will enable free and fair elections of their leaders. Then, in addition to this, there's too much emphasis on the size of the party in Maldives because finances are linked to it. Government subsidy, government support to political parties is very much dependent on the size of the party, the membership of the party. So parties compete with each other for membership. The custodian of political parties is the Election Commission, but the Election Commission, which has the mandate for party registration, is often accused of favoring a particular party and preventing or delaying membership applications in other less favored parties. There's still much that needs to be done to develop political parties by making the governance of parties more democratic. The oldest MDP continues to function without key office bearers. Party ideologies have to become clearer so that membership could follow ideas rather than political patrons. Party finances have to be more transparent and independent. Membership fees should largely replace contribution from businessmen. I now come to electoral issues. Elections were fiercely contested by all candidates in Maldives. Election rallies were held throughout the country. The atmosphere was charged with high expectation for a regime change after 30 years of rule by Mr. Qayyum. Final election rallies were electrifying. Over 10,000 people remained in heavy rain to listen to the last rally before the elections in 2008. Elections were held peacefully and under international observation. In the runoff elections, the results were in favor of Nasheed, as I said before. Qayyum thought that there were irregularities, but he decided not to create an issue out of it. The president-elect had agreed that he would form a coalition government with the smaller parties that supported him. New coalition government of 4 or 5 parties was formed, but conflicts began to arise immediately. The election experience from 2008 raised 3 issues. First, the capacity and independence of the Election Commission. Second, the role of the judiciary in resolving electoral issues. And finally, the legitimacy of failed coalition governments. Let me now talk about coalitions. Maldives is learning through experience, difficult experience, that coalition governments are problematic and hard to lead. However, so far in the last 2 elections, no single party was able to secure a clear majority in the first round of elections. Coalitions are made on short-term necessity to win the election. But once the election is over, a winner takes it all. The only compelling reason to remain in power-sharing arrangement would be the strength of the coalition partner in the parliament. But because parliament members are also allowed to change party membership without losing their seats, it has become common practice to steal members from each other. Another reason for coalition failure is conflicting and competing interests of the leaders of the coalition. After 2008 elections, within 21 days, the leader of Jamhuri Party, who was Minister of Home Affairs, resigned in protest because the government and coalition partners were either unable to offer him the state assets that he wanted or independence to run his ministry. The pace of social change, especially towards a more secular society, was too fast also for many people and contradicted Islamic nature of this state. Installation of statues and animals in public places following the SARC summit created an uproar. And the close relations that was being established with Israel became another contentious issue because the Maldivian people historically supported the rights of the Palestinian people. In each of the last 2 presidential elections, the Islamist Adalat Party played a significant role in supporting the winning candidates. They differed from other parties because their interests included promotion of Islam in addition to sharing the spoils. Differences are likely to arise in any coalition government. It is the inability to resolve them through political processes that leads to the weakening and the ultimate demise of any government. a coalition cabinet has to work a lot harder to be a team than an ordinary cabinet. Coalition leaders have to communicate better with each other. If not, others do the communication for you, and they often pass the wrong message. The fact that after 2012, change of government, the 8-party national unity government was able to keep the coalition together until the election of 2013 was a miracle to me too. An important issue that we also need to look at is the type of democracy and the political environment. That's why I put this topic, militant democracy and the rule of law. By a militant democracy, I mean one in which change is seen more as a function of protests and political activism. It is based on the notion that the institutions of the state function for change and progress only if there is pressure from political activists on the street. It is based on lack of trust of politicians and bureaucracies. We find that in countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, such activism has remained as part of the democratic system and become well entrenched. But the continuous disruptions in society and economy contribute to the continuation of underdevelopment and to perpetuate unemployment. Public protests and street demonstrations are a democratic right, no doubt, but the practice of such activism must also be within the law. Inadequate laws and regulations governing the management of protests and demonstrations open the door for ambiguity. Protesters want access to public spaces of importance close to government buildings and residences and offices of politicians. They also need protection. On the other hand, public officials and public in general have a right to be protected from abuse and attacks as well. This causes special problems for the police. I'll be happy to answer any questions on the police later on if you have. But the issue of strengthening the rule of law goes far beyond public order. All institutions of state have responsibilities for improving their respect for the rule of law. Presidents have to learn not to overstep the limits of the Constitution. It is unacceptable in any democracy for a president to order the arbitrary arrest of any citizen, let alone senior judges, as in the case of Maldives and in Pakistan, we've seen. It is unacceptable for a parliament also to threaten impeachment of a president or dismissal of ministers without due process. Similarly, judiciaries cannot indefinitely delay justice for the sake of political appeasement. The bureaucracies are an important factor also in democratic stabilization. It is said that a strong, well-established bureaucracy contributes to democratization. Francis Fukuyama says the existence of an effective bureaucracy depends on the historic sequence in which state modernization was undertaken relative to opening up of the franchise to broader political participation. On the other hand, if a democratic franchise opens up before such modernization had occurred, the state itself becomes an asset used by politicians seeking to mobilize votes with the lure of public employment. This is very true in my country. In Maldives, government is the main employer in the country with nearly 25,000 employees. Many senior positions were held by people who may have initially obtained their employment through patronage and loyalty to the old regime. The Civil Service Act was passed in 2007, and now the civil service is under Civil Service Commission. But the politicians felt, government felt, that there needed to be an added layer on the top of the civil service, political appointees who would ensure that government policies are implemented. The civil servants themselves were being suspected of being aligned to a former regime, so there was no trust in it. The popular saying used to be, we could govern with a laptop and 2 people, meaning there's no trust in the bureaucracy. To make the situation worse, civil servants were also allowed to become members of political parties. I will skip the part on local government at the moment because of the time, and go directly to the cost of democratic transition. Democracy is not cheap. No one had estimated that it would cost to implement comprehensive programs of democratization reform. Every branch of government was expanded under the new constitution, enlarged parliament, elected local councils in all the 192 islands, new independent commissions, and a strengthened judiciary all contributed to inflate the national budget. Introduction of proportional representation increased number of members in the parliament from 50 to 77 in 2008, and today to 85 in the last election, and it will keep on increasing. Elected local government officials increased from nil to over 1,000. So today, Maldives probably has the highest number of politicians per capita. It's unaffordable. In addition, the cost of campaigning, government's appeasement projects, new social handouts, all these things added up. 2 years into the new democracy, government was forced to start introducing unpopular measures. The IMF insisted the government should reduce the budget deficit by cutting down on expenses and devaluating the Maldives currency. Government cut the wages of civil servants and devalued the currency by 20%. To make the situation worse, parliamentarians decided to increase their wages and perks. A comprehensive analysis of financial costs of democratic transition would be important to better understand the affordability of democratic transition and reforms. It appears from the Maldives experience that a full immersion into democracy as opposed to a more gradual transition may be unaffordable, not only to Maldives, but also to many other developing countries. And finally, let me also give you a sense of what the economic situation was. The economic impact of 2004 Asian tsunami lingers on until today. Due to a large increase in spending following the tsunami, which included steep increases in wages, and the cost of tsunami reconstruction pushed public expenditures to an all-time high, reaching 63% of the GDP in 2008. Government expenditures almost doubled between 2004 and 2008. Added to this was the fallout from the global recession, severely weakening the country's balance of payment. It was estimated that the net negative impact of global recession was at least 24% of the 2009 GDP. By 2012, public debt had reached over 70% of the GDP. External shocks to the economy, the tsunami and the global recession, were unfortunate events over which Maldives had no control. It was our misfortune that the democratic transition coincided with those events and their consequences. The IMF and the World Bank assisted Maldives, but also through very unpopular measures like privatization of state enterprises such as the Malé International Airport, which became a huge issue, and the privatization of the telecommunications and utilities companies. The political fallout from these programs made the transition to democracy more painful and difficult. But difficult as they may be, Maldives will have to bring the fiscal situation under control. And now let me make some observations for conclusion. In this presentation, I have highlighted the issues Maldives is facing in its democratic transition. I have also mentioned the changes that are necessary to make the transition work for us. It is clear that the road to democracy is both rough and painful. Maldives is experiencing a tough transition to democracy, not because anyone wants a return to authoritarianism. The country is not divided along those who want democracy and those who are against it. On the contrary, everyone wants a more democratic, more prosperous Maldives. One may argue that by definition, rapid change is difficult and painful. It is my opinion that the transition process has become particularly painful for Maldives because of the constitutional and legal inconsistencies, weak democratic institutions, a terrible financial crisis, which began after the tsunami, inadequate understanding of the values of liberal democracy, and a sink-or-swim approach to introducing a multi-party democratic system without adequate planning and preparation. The greatest challenges to democratic transition in Maldives were the above factors, which to a large extent were responsible for the premature resignation of the first democratically elected president. It was a testing moment for democracy in the country. Unlike Egypt, the military officers in Maldives, most of whom trained at West Point and Sandhurst, had no desire to change the regime or to gain power for themselves. Unlike Egypt, there are no political prisoners in Maldives today. And the two former presidents in Egypt are in prison, while two former presidents in Maldives remain active in politics and head the two main rival political parties. Unlike Egypt or Tunisia, the Islamic party Adalat does not have the kind of popular political support to win a government. But its weight as a small party is valuable to both leading MDP and PPM in their bid for the next elections. Adalat is an advocate for Islam, but it doesn't espouse extremist views. Sometimes the international media overplays the importance of Islamic extremism in Maldives. Maldives is capable of engaging with more moderate scholars of Islam in other countries to promote more liberating and humane interpretations of the religion. Maldives' economy is improving today with unprecedented growth in the tourism sector, but the public finances have yet to be brought under control. Finally, democracy is taking root in Maldives. The transition will take more time, more challenges, more patience, and tolerance. It must be seen as a period of adjustment, adaptation, and more importantly, the opportunity for us to learn from the past, address remaining challenges in a spirit of cooperation and constructive engagement of the various political actors in the country. Then, Maldives can become a positive example of democracy for other Islamic countries, for the rest of Asia, and for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. We've got till 6:30, and I think you raised a number of very interesting issues. I just came out of a class where, in effect, we were discussing the huge transitions that are occurring from Libya at one end to, I stopped at Pakistan, but I should have included them all in my class. Thank you very much for a very systematic and also somewhat personal insight into what's happening there. So,
well, sir, thank you for your nice presentation. There was this assumption that democracy would lead to economic growth and development. Unfortunately, most of the South Asian countries are now witnessing democracy, and now they are going through a democratic transition period. But unfortunately, these countries are taking too much of time in transition period, and largely because they have largely been unable to, to consolidate their democratic institutions. If we see that their bureaucracy is weak and their parliament are mostly dysfunctional, and they have incredible election commissions, and mostly most of the political parties, they act quite irrationally, and their behaviors are not which is up to the mark. This is the reason. These are the reasons why these countries are struggling, and power transition is not very smooth. Most of the countries are still facing, this power transition crisis, particularly Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So, how do you think how long it will take to overcome this transition phase and move graduate to the next level? Thank you.
I don't know if there is an ideal democracy. But I think all of our countries are aspiring to improve human rights, government accountability, and so on. I think democracy is a journey rather than a destination. And the daily struggles will continue. There are always people who want political positions for what it can get them, rather than what it can get for the country. And our coalition government, for example, are formed to divide the spoils of the elections and the political war, rather than working together on common projects to improve the country. So these are some of the issues that we will have to deal with. I don't think anybody really has an answer as to how long it will take. But those countries with better checks and balances, with strong civil society, are probably making progress. Perhaps there are others who have ideas on this as well.
All right, I've got a question here, and I'll come to you. Gosh, I got so many. But let's take 2 or 3. Lady here, and then.
President Waheed, I've seen you both in office and out of office, and I thought that the time you served as president, you did a lot for the Maldives. I would always think of you as the most educated Maldivian leader who had a strategic vision. My question is, I noted the comments you made towards the end of your presentation with regard to the rise of Islamism in the Maldives. But as I have seen, more than 120 Maldivians have traveled to tribal Pakistan, to Afghanistan, trained and come back. Some of these Maldivians have conducted terrorist attacks in your own country, including a suicide attack in Pakistan, in Lahore. Also, a very small number of Maldivians have now traveled to Syria. Do you think Maldives have done enough to fight the rise of extremism in the Maldives?
Okay.
Yeah, I think more can be done. I believe that the current government has already made a statement that they will not allow Maldivians to travel to these places. And so I think that's a good step in the right direction. But the real solution lies within the country. A lot of these people are people who don't have jobs, who have been marginalized, who are educated at the same time. The Maldivians who are going out to fight are highly educated people in various fields, in information technology and others. So they are not going because they don't have an education or they don't know what's going on. They're going because they don't have the opportunities at the moment. So I think that's where we need to work on more.
All right, here. Oh, okay, you've got the mic.
Assalamu alaikum. Sir, my question is about the coalition government. You mentioned some problems with coalition governments, and we have seen in the 2008 election that it was a really bad experience. And in the current government, we have a bigger coalition, and I think now the cracks are beginning to appear. We are hearing about like some parties, especially regarding the special economic zones bill. So do you think it's going to be the same experience, or do you see any hope for the current government? Is it going to be the same experience as last time?
Oh, I hope not. I hope we have learned something from the past. But you are right. The cracks are there. And this is partly because coalitions are not made for development projects. Coalitions are being made for access to state assets, the projects, and the jobs. That's why the cracks are coming up. And also, as I said, communication. There is very little communication among coalition leaders. My experience, partly my fault also, but also in the previous coalition and the coalition now. This is really quite important because when you don't communicate as leaders, when you don't communicate, other people go and communicate for you, and they sometimes make more problems for you then if they don't. So I hope we have learned something. I hope that current coalition continues for the sake of stability in the Maldives. And it's really important for a country that relies so heavily on tourism. We cannot afford further volatility in the country. And I think people deep inside realize this, and that's probably why we have been able to maintain this peace and stability so far.
So, you alluded to the high cost of democratic transition. Indeed, that is the case. For a democracy to be sustainable, you need the institutions, you need laws and regulations, you need people to man these institutions, you need the judges, the lawyers to look at compliance and non-compliance, and that is a high cost. If you were to take the Singapore's example, we were very lucky that the British left behind some very good institutions, rules and regulations which we could strengthen upon, and also introduce a lot of new institutions and rules and laws and man them. And that cost a lot of money. And we were lucky in the sense that our economy was and still is able to afford that. But I'm just thinking in the case of Maldives, which is a small economy with a small population, that may be a bit of a struggle. But yet they are so important to sustain the democratic process. I'm just thinking whether, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity, as you know, whether your governments, the successive governments, have been trying to do too much within such a short time. Perhaps you should look at how to manage the process so that you, as to say, pluck the low-hanging fruits in terms of the process, laws and regulations and institutions and so on. Perhaps if I can ask you, if, and I'm sure you could be, again, a president of your country, you may be looking in how that process can be moderated so that you would have the capacity to introduce those institutions and so on. I think the capacity building is so important in the Maldives, and that's obviously requires a lot of resources.
Thank you, Dr. Cho. Dr. Cho is also the non-resident ambassador of Singapore to the Maldives. That's why he said not in his official capacity.
My personal capacity.
But talking about low-hanging fruits, I think there are some that can be immediately attended to. One is organizing elections at the same time. At the moment, we have 3 different elections, 3 different times in the term. And for each one of them, the Election Commission has to mobilize resources, send people out, and that is a lot of public money. But also, in addition to that, there's a lot of money for campaigning and a lot of money from the government that has to spend on not just people, but on also projects to win votes. And so I think just by realigning the 3 elections, election for president, for the parliament, and for local government, Maldives will save an enormous amount of money. The second one would be put a stop to this indefinite increase of parliament members. A small country with 300,000 people don't need over 85 members of parliament. Another would be also limiting the number of elected officials in the islands. 5 elected officials in the island have nothing to do except create mischief. Because a lot of them are good people. They don't have the resources to do anything. Therefore, I think there are already plans to try to limit the number of elected officials in the country, and that will really help. Also, I think the governments will have to become more realistic about what it can do in the short term.
Yeah. India has 1 MP for 2 million people, some scale. Now, I'm going to take 4 questions that I've noticed right away. But I don't dare deny my colleagues, Rahul, Cheng Kang, and then a couple of my students as well.
Yes.
And then 1 there. So we'll take 5. Maybe
yes.
We're running out of time.
We'll wait for the questions. We'll wait for the questions.
I think let's get them all together
yes,
now, and then you pick and choose your favorites, I think. So I'll go Cheng Kang and then Rahul.
Okay, Dr. Waheed, you mentioned that it's difficult to manage the coalition government. And this happened to all the nation democracies because there are just too many parties. In some countries, they use some way to bundle the property rights, the fragment property rights. For instance, in Indonesia, you had to win at least 3% of the votes in last election in order to run for the next election. And quickly the number of parties reduced from 40 to 30 now to 12. And this, Maldives has this kind of hurdles for the party to pass through, and therefore reduce the number of parties.
Okay, Rahul.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Waheed, for a great talk, model of analysis. I'm curious about one thing in particular. Most countries that use proportional representative systems, unless they're very stable, long-term democracies, they tend to suffer under those kinds of systems. There's lots of evidence in political science to show if you choose a first-past-the-post, two-party system, you get people competing for the middle vote, so they moderate themselves, they don't go to the extremes. Like they do in a proportional system. What was the, if you think of Israel or Italy or any of these countries that have proportional systems, relatively young proportional representative systems, they have very unstable, traumatic politics. What was the thinking behind Maldives' decision to have a proportional representative system, and how committed do you think they are to it? Would they be willing to change it? Because I suspect if you went with the first-past-the-post system, if that sort of change is possible, you'd get much more clustering around the middle, and moderate, sensible people like yourself would be, and parties of these kinds, the two figures we have up here, are more likely to be winners in that kind of setting, rather than small extremist parties.
Okay. Colin here, and then Nadeem, actually. Umar. Colin.
Thank you. Good evening, His Excellency, Mr. President. My name is Lin. I'm from Myanmar. I'm a Master in Public Policy candidate from Lee Kuan Yew School. My question is it's about related to Myanmar. The Myanmar started the long journey democratization process since 2010. And what are your suggestions to Myanmar, such as do and don'ts in democratization process in Myanmar? Thank you.
Shout. We're running out. Oh, there's one. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Waheed, for raising very, very poignant questions here, especially the cost of democracy that you mentioned. My question is very basic, and you all mentioned it in your speech as well. You said that when are we ready for democracy? You raised that question. Coming from Pakistan, we are battling this question every single day. So when is a country ready for actual and true democracy?
You got the last word.
So you spoke about the requirement that all citizens of Maldives need to be Islam. My question is, as Maldives hopes to be a full-fledged democracy and bring in greater reforms, be it economic or political, do you think that this requirement can continue? And additionally, can newly democratized regimes restrict freedom of religion? Just wanted to get your thoughts.
Okay.
Okay.
All yours.
All right. There is concern in Maldives about the large number of small political parties. And of course, the two big parties want to be just themselves. They don't want any other party. So in the preparation of the Political Parties Act, the two big parties decided that all small parties with less than 10,000 members should be banned. And of course, that was also targeted to some extent indirectly to me, because I didn't have 10,000 members in my party. The issue was referred to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. So that is already, I think what's happening is with time, number of the small parties are beginning to go away. You see, they cannot keep up. Particularly with the high cost of, campaigning and operation of political parties. Therefore, I think there will be a natural process of elimination, and it will become fewer. Essentially, now, out of 13 political parties, 4 of them have emerged as the stronger ones. Okay, out of that, 2 are clearly way ahead. In terms of Rahul. You see, the criteria that's being used at the moment is one member per so many citizens. And the more the population increases, more members you will have in parliament. I think it cannot go on forever. There are two factors. One is also, of course, the cost of it, but also Maldives is quite fluid in terms of the islands now. There is a policy of trying to get people to live on bigger islands, incentives that are being given. So the number of islands will also decrease. And so we will be able to align that more rationally and more efficiently. We cannot afford to keep the 5,000 figure for very long. And I think the parliament itself realizes it.
I think his question was, why a proportional representation system rather than first past the post as an election system?
You
want to come back to that
exactly
later?
sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Question on Burma.
The other question for Myanmar, I think Myanmar is being very careful in the way it is progressing towards democracy. And there may be some wisdom in it, but I'm sure it is not acceptable to most of the political parties. And so I think, particularly, I think the people of Myanmar and also the international community expect free and fair elections where everybody can participate. And I think that's really quite important. And there's no reason why holding a free and fair election could actually get things out of control. When are you ready for democracy? I mentioned a couple of them, a couple of the things that I thought were important and I'm beginning to see in other countries. I've mentioned Jordan. The King of Jordan has introduced this program for young people where he wants young people to begin to understand and learn about democratic values and democratic systems. And I think that's quite important. You know, liberal Western democracies are not invented in our part of the world. They come from a particular philosophical and historical background. And therefore, it is important also for some of those values to be become part of our own worldview for us to have the kind of liberal democracy we are talking about. And as I said, education has a major role in it. It's failure of education sometimes that leads to the breakdown. On the issue of religious freedom, you're right. You know, this is a contentious issue. You cannot have a democratic country with all the human rights without freedom of religion. And I think it will be only a matter of time. Otherwise, you know, already as we are seeing in Maldives, there is discontent about this. There was a case where one young person openly came out and said, "I am not Muslim." You know, that's not allowed at the moment. But how long can you suppress it? It's only a matter of time. So I hope this is, as I said earlier, this is still a work in progress. And the time that I'm spending here, I'm trying to better understand this process and hope that I will be able to speak and write about this more in the future. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.